illustrate countries with a Wagner Group presence massively inflated its capacity. Moreover, the motivations for the recent raft of coups in Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan have been rooted in domestic problems. In the case of Nigeria, for example, military leaders appear to have acted in the largest part to protect their own positions after the now deposed president drew up plans to replace them, as well as to potentially stop a new investigation into the country's biggest ever procurement scandal, which diverted nearly half of the country's defense budget. This show will therefore seek to separate the myth from the reality, bringing together researchers and analysts to discuss where Russia and Wagner are significant actors and where they are not. We will also explore why some citizens and commentators see Russia as a preferable partner, despite its many economic shortcomings, history of political repression at home and imperialism abroad, as well as its limited investment in Africa. Helping me to guide today's discussion is my colleague, Jeffrey Smith. Hey, Jeff, how are you today?
Hey, Mentade, I'm doing great, and I'm so happy to be back here with all of you and to bring this excellent, most timely show to our viewers. And to remind everyone and to remind the many new viewers who are tuning in today, the Resistance Bureau focuses on the major threats to human rights and freedom in Africa and worldwide, while shining a light on the enduring struggles for freedom. This show features leaders who are shaping African politics and the way the world views the continent. It is in this spirit that we are joined by today's panel. First, we have Samuel Romani, among the world's most astute analysts of the Wagner Group. If you've been following recent developments in Niger and elsewhere in the Sahel, you've surely seen Samuel on the BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, or perhaps on Twitter, where he has a considerable following. His most recent book, Russia in Africa, could not be more apt for today's program, and we encourage all of you to check it out. We are also joined by Marissa Laurenceau, a political and economic risk analyst with a special focus on Southern Africa. She has published extensively in a range of outlets on issues pertaining to the Russia-Africa Summit and the spate of military coups across the Sahel. Next, we have Beverly Ochieng, an Africa security and political analyst at BBC Monitoring. She is an experienced journalist and a frequent commentator on major security developments in sub-Saharan Africa, with a particular focus on West Africa, the Sahel, and Wagner Group activities. Last, but certainly not least, we have with us Kisi Okomo, a peace-building expert from the Central African Republic, a first from that country on this program. She runs a nationwide NGO that encourages the participation of young people in CAR's peace and recovery process. She was also an inaugural Mandela Washington Fellow and is a member of the UN Advisory Board on Youth, Peace, and Security. Our discussant today, who will speak with us after the panel, is John Lechner, a freelance journalist who has extensive experience reporting on the politics of Russia and African nations. Just last week, he co-authored a fantastic piece entitled Why the Wagner Group Won't Leave Africa, and has a related book that is due to be released next year. For our listeners, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Resist Bureau and to use the hashtag Resist Bureau Live for today's show. Right now, we are streaming on Facebook Live and on YouTube, as well as recording the show for later distribution. In addition to our speakers, we also depend on you, our audience, to share your thoughts through our YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram comment sections. Thanks to everyone, and there were many of you who sent in questions this week, and we'll do our best today to get to them. You can also send us your questions directly via WhatsApp on the number available on your screen right now. So with all of that said, Mentade, back over to you to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So Samuel, I'd like to start with you since you literally wrote the book on today's topic. Over the past year, many of us have seen what appears to be greatly exaggerated claims about the role of the Wagner Group and the extent of its presence in Africa. Please break this down for us. Where is the Wagner Group operating in Africa, and what has been their impact to date?
Sure, yeah, happy to break that down very briefly. I would say that the Wagner Group was founded in or around 2014. Its two major figures at the early stages were the Dmitry Yudkin, and was a former GRU operative, as well as Yevgeny Prigozhin, the businessman who at the time was the head of Concord Catering and who had established himself over the previous 15 years or more as a relatively close confidant of Putin and known him from St. Petersburg. And initially, their operations were confined to the Ukrainian theater. In particular, they were acting as kind of a force multiplier and auxiliary to the undeclared Russian military intervention in Donbass. Then they migrated globally into the Syrian theater. And then in or around 2017, early 2018, they started migrating into Africa. And they entered Africa, first of all, through Libya, where they established alignment with Libyan National Army chieftain Khalifa Haftar, and provided sniper training, logistical assistance, guarding of facilities and bases, and worked alongside the United Arab Emirates and Haftar's forces in terms of ensuring his dominance over large swathes of the eastern and southern parts of the country. The next theater that they most likely entered was probably Sudan, because in November of 2017, Omar al-Bashir and Vladimir Putin had a meeting where Bashir and Sochi asked Russia for help against the perceived threat of American aggression against his country. And pretty soon after that, we saw Prigozhin, Dmitry Medvedev, who was then Russia's prime minister, work together. And Medvedev was actually a guarantor of this, sign a deal with from Merrill Gold into Sudan's gold reserves. And that paved the way for the entry of Wagner forces to guard those gold reserves and also to back the Bashir regime and to promote autocracy more broadly. The next theater of operation was Central African Republic, which probably began negotiations around the same time as Sudan, maybe even a little earlier, because in August of 2017, the Russians and the CAR established a military cooperation agreement just months after the French ended Operation Sangaris. And through Prigozhin shell companies, Lobe Invest, which is another one like Merrill Gold, they managed to establish a significant stake in Central African Republic's diamond reserves, guarding those, and then providing a variety of services to the Central African Republic president, Boston Archange Touadera, from acting as his bodyguards to helping him fight the ex-Seleka rebels, while also negotiating with a variety of other opposition factions and doing a bit of double and triple dealing, as Russia likes to hedge its bets. Then they moved into Mozambique. It was an abortive disaster in 2019 where they fought ISIS. They had 7 of their operatives get their heads cut off and they had to retreat. They meddled politically in Madagascar with a similar disaster situation with regards to the elections. Their preferred candidates barely got 1 or 2% of the vote. And then they settled in Mali as their 4th major theater of operation in the end of 2021, again, outmuscling the French and forcing them to wind down Operation Barkhane. So the 4 core theaters of operation where Wagner exists are in Libya, Central African Republic, Sudan, and Mali. And they have allegedly established a little bit of a beachhead in the Republic of Congo. We haven't heard much about that since 2019. And also they established some guardianship in aluminum reserves for Rusal and Guinea. Again, we haven't heard much about that since the coup that overthrew Condé. But those are the 4 key theaters of operation. And they do everything from counterinsurgency and counterterrorism to autocracy promotion to the guarding of mineral assets, of which Prigozhin and Wagner get a significant cut. And even the gold reserves from Sudan go straight to the Russian central bank. So it's got a variety of dimensions, as you can see.
Thank you so much, Samuel, for that really expansive but concise explanation of the activities on the African continent. But let's drill down a bit more and get a bit more granular here. I want to ask you specifically about the recent coup in Niger, which obviously has generated tons of international headlines. We know that Niger's new military leaders asked the Wagner Group for help against a potential regional military intervention. And several days ago, in fact, ECOWAS ordered a deployment of a standby force. What is the current situation as we sit here discussing these issues today? And what big developments are you looking out for this week? And what should we be tracking as this situation unfolds?
Yeah, certainly there's a variety of things that we should be tracking and paying attention to. First, I wanted to make a brief comment about Russia's position with regards to this. And if you look at my book, Russia in Africa, you'll see that Niger barely gets a mention because Russia doesn't really view Niger as a country where it's had substantial influence or substantial connections. There was one MOU on counterterrorism that was kind of disguised into a military technical agreement signed around the same time as with Nigeria and Chad in August of 2017. So same time as they were talking to CAR, they were talking to a variety of other countries. But there really wasn't much in the way of major transfers of Russian military technology on a large scale or any kind of movement of Russian ground forces or real concrete counterterrorism assistance that's there. So Russia is very much a newcomer in the Niger theater. And it's been involved in Niger's information space by supporting the narratives of groups like M62, which were opposed to Bazoum's decision in April of 2022 to authorize the deployment of foreign troops, including French troops, into the country. And they also were spreading conspiracies about the fact that, 95% of the uranium that's in Niger is being harvested by the French. So Prigozhin said that wasn't new. Russian media outlets have been pushing that for quite a long time, but counterterrorism is just a disguise for economic plunder. So they were involved in the information space, but they haven't really been involved very much politically and militarily. That's the point that I want to make. And because of that, I think that they're going to have a very difficult task in terms of entering and consolidating themselves inside Niger. I think that, first of all, they got to find a source of financing. And with Kremlin cutting its budget potentially, it's really unclear where they're going to get that financial source from. Also, the Nigerian junta may be blasting the insecurity situation that they face. But they'll have to know that in 2022, Niger saw a reduction in civilian casualties. Mali saw a 270% increase in civilian casualties with Wagner over there. So if the Nigerian junta has anything rational going on, they'd look at that and they'd be like, maybe we don't want that kind of influence coming into our country. So I think that there's a good chance the Nigerian junta could do what Burkina Faso did, like kind of create the speculation, create the illusion that Wagner might enter, build closer ties with Russia as a country, have maybe some instructors to help them train in military technology, as they get squeezed out by the West, but not really a large-scale Mali-style Wagner deployment. The one game changer that might make Niger more overtly court Wagner is the case of an ECOWAS military intervention. And ECOWAS, I think, is not likely to take military action immediately. I think they're going to try to see how the sanctions are going to work in the short term, which includes electricity cutoff from Nigeria and really affecting the economy of a landlocked country. There's rumors now that even within ECOWAS, Togo is now standing against the intervention. Cote d'Ivoire seems to be much more vocal about it than Nigeria, which is the most powerful country. Nigerian Senate opposes it. The president is saying that it's the last resort. And Algeria and Chad, two non-ECOWAS countries very close to Niger that have influence in the situation, are both strongly opposed to military intervention. I think even in the case of a military intervention, Niger might ask Wagner for help, but Wagner might not want to step in because Russia's got substantial economic interests with Nigeria and aspirations to build ties in West Africa on the coast too, and doesn't want to burn those. So I think that there's a low risk of an ECOWAS military intervention. That might be the situation where Niger's junta puts his back to the wall and asks Russia for help. But for the reasons I stated, I think that Russia is unlikely to really step in a significant way going forward. Equally, I don't see the coup getting reversed anytime soon. I think the appointment of 21 new ministers, the threats to either kill Bazoum, as noted to Victoria Nuland, or to at the very least try him for high treason, where he has the risk of the death penalty, suggests that they're digging their heels in and they're trying to rally patriotic sentiment at home. And that seems to be working for now. Like the majority of Nigerians don't want external intervention. And when there was a poll, they asked, who do you want to see intervene? 50% said the Russians, 16% said the United States, just 14% said African Union, 4% said ECOWAS. So ECOWAS intervention is extremely unpopular and the junta is here to stay. So I think the junta is here to stay. ECOWAS are unlikely to intervene. And regardless of what they do or don't do, Russia is going to have a hard task entering and selling itself as a real effective force in Niger.
Thank you very much, Samuel. I appreciate that. And Marissa, I think this is a good spot to bring you in because we heard Samuel, raise the specter and the fact of Wagner and Russian activity in Southern Africa. And this is your area of expertise. You heard him raise Mozambique and Madagascar among them. And of course, the Wagner Group is part of a larger narrative involving Russia, which posits that Putin and his government are a major threat to democracy and stability across the African continent. Many experts will say that these claims are exaggerated. Some will say they are not. So we wanted to ask you about the recent scandal that took place on the docks in Cape Town, South Africa, and how that particular instance might help to inform our understanding of this relationship.
Sure. So I think that the South African example, in terms of how it's been perceived in the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict, is a really good example of how perception can really strongly influence reality, even if they are just perceptions and not proven fact. So what happened with that situation that you mentioned at the docks of Cape Town is that the US ambassador to South Africa went to the local media here and said that the South African government had put on arms onto the ship that were destined for Russia, and that effectively these were going to be used in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Immediately, the South African government responded and said that this wasn't true, but it had a very deep impact effectively on global sentiment towards South Africa. So we saw the currency perform very, very badly because people had been very jittery since the outbreak of the conflict and South Africa's refusal to condemn it. So South Africa, throughout all of the United Nations General Assembly votes, has remained neutral. But for the US, this has really been perceived as a kind of slight against it. For them, they believe that South Africa should unequivocally condemn Russia's actions. And there was nothing necessarily to suggest, maybe some misplaced remarks from ministers here and there, but there was nothing necessarily, suggestions that the South African government was in support of Russia. If we actually look at what the administration led by President Cyril Ramaphosa has actually done, all the indications are that he really would like the conflict to end. He and a few other African leaders did try to meet with Putin and Zelensky a few months back to try to negotiate an end to the conflict. If we look at the recent Russia-Africa summit as well, most of the leaders there, including Ramaphosa, said that they did want to see an end to this. But I think that it kind of shows us two things about the US and the way that we kind of have tended to look at these issues. I think the first is that the US is not used to this changing world in which it's not as easy to get people onto its side, or it's not as easy to get people to pick a side. It's not the same as it was during the Cold War, where, African countries really had to pick the Soviet Union or they had to pick the Americans. The US, I think, is worried about its waning power because of the rise of Russia and China, especially China. And the second thing is, and this applies more widely in the Southern African region, is that I think that this kind of mis and disinformation about Russia's influence has been able to spread quite rapidly, because we are still very tied to these kind of ideas back from Southern Africa's liberation struggles, which really did have very heavy involvement, of course, not of Russia, but of the Soviet Union. And this is the lens that we have tended to look through this. And this is really why these events can have this kind of impact. And I think that we have seen this very visibly in South Africa. We've also seen it quite clearly in countries like Angola and Mozambique over the past year.
Thank you so much, Marisa. I think one of the biggest questions around this is also around where this misinformation is coming from. For a lot of instances, you find that the ordinary people that just consume the media, you give an example of an instance where media was used to misinform the public. And then also we're looking at the fact that if it's coming from authority, people tend to take what is placed in front of them because it seems to come from legitimate sources. So I really am interested to see how we can maneuver this reality that it mostly comes from voices of authority. How do we begin to maneuver that space? But then also on the other hand, because I think Samuel went extensively to talk about the actual activities of the Wagner Group in Russia, in Africa. So I would still want to ask, what are the long-term implications of these activities in the continent? Is this a broader threat? And if so, are there specific countries or governments in the Southern Africa region or elsewhere that are more at risk? So it's more of a two-sided question.
Sure. So I think that when it comes to misinformation or disinformation, it's very difficult to fight against, because we do have pockets of South African media that are very distrustful of the government. And I think that this is really justified from South Africa's previous kind of decade of corruption under former President Jacob Zuma. And it really was the media and civil society that did start to raise these issues. And it's really them that we have to thank for bringing a lot of what was going on to our attention. But this distrust of government has continued, that if government is even perceived as putting a foot wrong, it immediately gets a lot of backlash from the media, and people sort of look at the media and they take that as fact. So fighting against that, I think, is, I don't really have the answer for that, because I think that that's something, that is kind of a combination of the media's influence, but is also just a combination of attitudes in South African society, at least from what I can see. If we're looking at Southern Africa and we're looking at the influence of the Wagner Group, so Samuel mentioned at the beginning that the Wagner Group did a brief excursion into Mozambique. It actually wasn't fighting ISIS at that point. It was effectively fighting the local terrorist group before they had pledged allegiance to ISIS, which they then did 2 years later. It was absolutely disastrous for the group, and they have not been back since they retreated. They're not present anywhere else in Southern Africa. And then if we look at Russia's influence, again, it's been completely overstated, again, through that lens of, the Soviet Union supported these countries before. So if we look at a country like Angola, it's been actively moving away from Russia in the past 4 to 5 years under President João Lourenço. Effectively, what he has done is he's pivoting a lot more to the West. We're also seeing a lot more players from the Middle East. We're seeing Turkey come in as well. So Russia is no longer the kind of important partner there that it once was. The president has even said that he'd actually like to get arms from NATO and not from Russia. And this is really interesting because if we do look at the influence that Russia has in Southern African countries, but also more broadly on the continent, it is basically just being the main importer of arms. And it's not really much more than that. So sometimes we do see Russia's name appearing, on trade sheets, but it's not really any kind of significant trade. And then if we look at other governments in the region as well, Mozambique is another country that has remained neutral. But again, Mozambique is a country that its government will play both sides so that it can get the most out of either side. So if it can get help from the US, the EU, and Russia, it'll be happy with that. And then the other governments in the region have kind of been split on this. They've either remained neutral or we've actually seen countries like Zambia vote against Russia at all of the UN General Assemblies.
Thank you so much, Marisa. So Beverly, I'm going to bring you into the conversation as you are a media practitioner. So what do you see as the role of the media where the often blurry lines of myth and reality surrounding the Wagner Group and Russian activities in Africa are concerned? How do you assess the work of the media, both domestic and international thus far?
Well, that tends to be very difficult because, to begin with, the Wagner Group is operating in areas where media freedoms, we're seeing a significant decline of that. So if I give you a couple of examples of how those media operations are working, and then how there's some counter narratives that are not really doing as much in terms of countering that back. So the Wagner Group gains resonance by co-opting messages, sentiment from local groups. A lot of it is coming from civil society groups. Like in Mali, we've seen groups publicly talking vocally about supporting the Wagner Group. There's one called Yerewolo, there's one called the Collective for the Defense of the Military, and a few others. We're seeing that increasingly now in Niger with groups like M62 being co-opted for things like that. In Burkina Faso, some with called Russo, Burkina Corporation. And because it comes from those groups, it gains public resonance. People are able to identify themselves in those messages, even though some of them might be erroneous, inaccurate, or just downright misinformation. Examples such as French forces are supporting terrorist presence in the Sahel, or even with what we've seen recently in Niger, where they are amplifying the reports that the French forces had attacked the Nigerian army. Then there's the other thing that the media itself is largely disempowered in countries like that because intolerance is rising. As it is, journalists in Niger are already complaining about the fact that the state is going against anyone with an opposition voice. State media has been co-opting pro-junta messages. And in some instances, we're seeing, Russian flags are getting a lot of prominence. And there's that conflation between Russian activities and what the Wagner Group is doing. In countries like the CAR, there are very few media sources that would be able to operate as a credible opposition voice. Over the years, the CAR has either shut down agencies that are critical towards the government and its security operations. They have attacked some journalists who are seen to be reporting about the security situation, particularly operations by the Wagner Group. So if you're working in that environment, it's very difficult for you within those countries to establish a means of speaking back. It doesn't mean that there's none. In Mali, there's one initiative called Benbere, which is one way of sort of debunking false narratives that emerge, many of them which come through pro-Wagner, pro-Russian, and even just other groups that are used to disseminating fake information. International media, to some extent, does have a role in being able to make sure that there are truthful narratives. I mean, the BBC has things like BBC Verify, which would be looking at what is the false narrative that came out and how do we debunk that and what has been said about this. And the transparency behind that debunking of information is also important because people can also dismiss that. And you'll see how it's so much easier for a lie to get along than for the truth to really get the same kind of traction. So it's a huge thing. Another thing is people's own digital civic education. Where the Wagner Group is operating is areas where there are sometimes very low levels of digital literacy, civic literacy, and even with media interactions. Trust tends to be with the authoritative figures, and sometimes they're the ones who would be undermining that trust and disseminating that propaganda. So if you're looking at, say, Radio Johnny Sango or Lengo Songo in the CAR, which does have government people appearing and speaking authoritatively, but also pro-Russian sentiment, peppered alongside other programming, it sort of makes it very difficult to distinguish between things that are being inaccurately represented, whether it's attacks on the UN forces or on security forces, international forces, and what is actually the truth. So it's so hard to disentangle in many instances.
Thank you, Beverly, for that. A quick follow-up question for you. I read with interest an op-ed in The Guardian, I believe it was last week, from Gary Amadou, who's an editor of a daily newspaper in Niger. And he was saying, or rather, he wrote that the amount of support for Russia and the Wagner group is largely due to misinformation, to your point, but also state propaganda. And he also brought up the role of so-called Pan-African influencers online who are rumored to be on the Kremlin payroll. Do you think this downplaying of support for Russia and the Wagner group is credible? Is it true? Or is there, in fact, in your experience at BBC Monitoring and in the line of work you do, is there more widespread support for this alternative brand of leadership that is symbolized in large part by the Kremlin?
So there is reason to worry legitimately about what this kind of disinformation is doing, because it is, to some extent, affecting foreign policy or even security policy. And there are other underlying issues that, of course, led to the French forces leaving Mali, for instance, or the UN peacekeeping force drawing down, or even the kind of attacks and disinformation we're seeing against UN peacekeeping forces. Some of it rides on pre-existing sentiment. So it's not entirely false. It tends to be rather inflated, amplified, exaggerated. And it goes back to who is sending you that message. So these Pan-Africanist groups have been able to make use of ideas around sovereignty, because if you're looking at even some of the recent support behind the military coups in the Sahel, it's about sovereignty and freedom. It's about speaking against so-called imperialist powers who will be undermining or making policy decisions on your behalf, because that's the perception that is created. And so you will see these pro-Wagner, pro-Russian, Pan-Africanist groups riding on that sentiment and using it to be able to galvanize public support for the juntas or for Russia. Now, there's the impression that sometimes it's isolated in urban areas where it's possible to mobilize online. But these groups are now even operating offline. And if you're watching state TV in Niger over recent days, or even over the years that I've been watching the coups in Mali, in Burkina Faso, it's these groups are very widely dispersed. They are a certain age group or age range, very post-colonial. They will speak anti-colonial invective. They know how to mobilize outside the usual online spaces. So it does demonstrate that there's a lot of widespread resonance for this ideology. And the fact that it seems that those policies or things that they're pushing for instance, like pushing against French media presence. And we've seen Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger banning RFE, France 24 from operating in the country, and even there being some attacks against journalists who are still present in those countries. You wonder what the link between those groups and the respective military authorities is, and how much influence and power they wield, and then now connecting it back to how far does it go with the Kremlin. Right before the Russia-Africa summit, there had been some reports in French media that some sections of African journalists and influencers had been sent in the lead up to the St. Petersburg meeting to promote Russian presence or to promote Russian interests in the region. And it's playing out in different ways. There's one particular person who has really taken on the name, the Dame of Sochi. Her name is Natalie Am. And she was at the Sochi summit in 2019. And she has been a very vocal anti-French, pro-Russian activist online. She's had people who are affiliated with her, who have visited Bamako, who have rallied protests in support of Russia. So there's a way it operates that gives it this inflated feeling, but it is worrying when you see it triggering certain foreign policy or security changes.
Thanks, Beverly. Really appreciate that insight. And Kisi, we just wanted to pivot to you right now. Thank you so much for joining us. My first question for you has to do with getting your reactions to a recent blog post that was written for us at Vanguard, actually, by an activist from Togo, Farida Nabarima. And she wrote really provocatively that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about African youth and their seeming embrace of military rule. She noted in her piece that all indicators suggest resilient support for democracy, but that large segments in CAR and elsewhere are becoming disillusioned with their current leaders, including those who have come to power through electoral coups, as in Sierra Leone most recently. And so they're looking for alternatives. How do you respond to that assessment, given the environment in CAR and the issues that you work on?
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. I think that one of the main things we have to pay attention to, that we need to understand, is the fact that young people in Africa, mainly, we grew up with that idea that the continent is not, moving forward because of the Western policies on the continent. And based on that, we grew up with that kind of frustration. If you don't go to school, it's because the French, if I give the example of Central African Republic, is that if, there's a coup, it means that the French are behind it. If you just can go to school, it means that the French are destroy the system, more or less. So it's like that kind of narrative, we grow up with that. And as Beverly just mentioned, like the dynamic that we receive, the narrative that we receive from the Pan-African, the new Pan-Africanist online is really like, really has a resonate for young people in Central African Republic, and not just in the capital, but also outside the capital, where there's more victim of the conflict in CAR. So for them having, not just because of them, it's not just a question of democracy, but the fact that they see MINUSCA, the UN mission in CAR, that they are not able to really play their role to protect the population sometimes. And the fact that the French of Sangaris left the country at a really hard, difficult moment for the country means that, yes, the Western agenda in CAR is not useful anymore. And so we need alternative. So it's not really on the democratic narrative, but more on the security level. And I want to highlight like the example of, I travel around the country a lot for my work, and I met with a lot of young people. When I try to ask them like why they support, the presence of Wagner there, I understood that is for us, we need to like break down a bit the way we analyze things. It's not, it's not to intellectualize things. For those young people is that they live a lot of difficult things. They saw that our former government or former president and other was not able, while working with Western countries, they was not able to support, like to bring peace back. So for them, like it's a kind of, let's try the Russian or the Wagner narrative. And one thing is important to mention also is that they don't know much. There's not really a lot of information on the role and the presence of Wagner, what they did in the other country. People are not really aware of that. So for them, it's kind of new. They see new people coming and fighting against mercenaries and or jihadists and others. So for them, it's like, let's try and let's try to see what we can do together. And so for me, it's like we need to understand first what the population live before like we judge if they are right or wrong in their decision to support or not Wagner at some point.
Thank you so much, Cassie. So one of the things I'm very curious about is this entire conversation that we've been having, right? And talking about, for instance, the fact that there are communities that are basically buying what they're seeing online and then just running with it, whether you're pro or against. And my question is around, can we identify the impact of the activities of the Wagner Group on ordinary people? You gave an example of young people who basically just support because of what they're consuming online. For those young people that are pro, for those young people that are against, what is the direct impact on them? And then the second element I wanted to engage you on is because you do so much work in different parts of the country. Have you seen any kind of work pushing back on some of those activities, or have you been involved in any? Like, what are young people doing? What are communities doing?
Yeah, like the pro and like against Wagner, the impact on them most of the time when you are for, we are supporting Wagner, it means at some point that you are linked to the government. I mean that you support the president actually, because the Wagner narrative is, and they don't even call them Wagner, actually they call them the Russian. So it's like you are supporting the Russian agenda and just supporting the president. So when you are supporting, you are for, for the presence of Wagner in CAR, it means that you are the one. If the government organized something related to the presidential agenda or propaganda, you will support it. So you just can support Wagner and not be with the president. It's completely linked to each other. And when you're against it, of course, like it means that you represent a threat for the government and for the population in general. So they use a narrative that they find online, mainly by Nathalie Yamb or by Kemi Seba, those kind of really powerful activists, new Pan-Africanist activists, really pro-Russian. And also they use the same narrative like to target the young people who are not with the Wagner. And so for me, I saw the impact for the people who are against them in the fact that they are not, it's like they really reduce the civic space. So it means that you don't have the space to talk a lot. Even me, at some point, you just can't go public and talk, share your point of view. If you question the role and the action of Wagner on the field, it means that you represent a threat for the state. And so like the media, the newspaper, will you write your name, write like a huge op-ed, let's say, on you saying that you are kind of terrorist for the country. And more they use that word to target people or young people who are against the presence of Wagner there. For the people who are who support Wagner, they don't receive a lot of kind of feedback or something positive. They don't receive a lot of money for that, but it's just that it's kind of trendy. It's like you are part of a new dynamic, and it's part of the narrative of Wagner in Ga, saying to young people that you are part of that new generation able like to destroy the Western presence in Ga, and you can change your country by doing so. So it's like they give a kind of a mission to those young people, a meaning in their role also. So this is the kind of impact that I see from the both sides. And the presence of Wagner, for your second question on the presence of Wagner on the field, Wagner is quite present in the mining sector, the timber. You'll find them also like they sell beer, vodka, and other, and then vodka and also water. Now they are doing water. That is quite interesting. So it's like all around all those business, you have a lot of young people around it. So they kind of give the vision, the kind of perception that they are giving access or creating job for young people. And it's quite appealing, and they come with that narrative of development rather than to offer aid, support, which is like one of the main, the humanitarian narrative. People are kind of tired of it. Young people are kind of tired of it because they don't see opportunities when young people want to try to develop kind of business. People, the humanitarian sector will say that it's not a good moment to do business. But Wagner said to those young people that yes, by doing business with us, you are also preparing the space for you to do business in the future. And so it's part of their fake news, disinformation, but at the same time, it works a lot. So they integrate young people in their work on the field, but they're also the relation, what I saw on the field also, it's there's a weird relation between them and the population in the most remote areas. I give the example of Bombari, where we have like one of the most famous mining sector, which is in Dashima. I think you heard about it. The expert here heard a lot about it. Wagner is now present in that mine. And the thing is that they have young people with them, but those young people used to be part of the anti-Balaka group. So they work with the former combatants. And so the kind of reintegration in a context where DDR doesn't work, they're kind of like giving the opportunity to those young people, former combatants, to join them. But at the same time, the communities are kind of afraid of them. So they are quite active in the region, so in Bombari, but the population don't want to get close to them because they are scared of their reaction, because the population told me that they saw how violent they are. And so for them, like they create a kind of distance where they are free to do whatever they want in the mining sector, and the population have nothing to say, even the community leaders. So it's like they are quite proactive there, and they are there to stay, let's say so.
Thank you so much, Kisi, and for everyone for those valuable contributions. I've been so impressed with both the depth and the breadth of your insights, and a testament to your expertise. We finished exactly on time, and right on time to turn the stage over to our colleague, Nick Cheeseman, and today's featured discussant, John Lechner, who's been waiting very patiently to get their respective reactions to this conversation so far. and to get their insights into their work on these issues that we've been covering today. I see a lot of questions coming in. So Nick, you have your hands full, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Yeah. So just before we pass over to John, and I should say one of the great things about, I think, this conversation is we've got a lot of people who spent time on the ground, right? And one of the problems of this discussion in general is it's been driven too much on social media by people who haven't been to the countries we've talked about and don't actually have the depth of knowledge. So it's great to have this show and to bring people who actually have been, and in a minute, John will bring his expertise. Just two things I wanted to flag. I think people have done a great, job of kind of trying to cover what's the myth, what's the reality. Actually, Wagner isn't in that many countries, and we need to keep that in mind. Russia isn't in that many countries, but of course, where they are, they may shape perceptions and they may shape the way that the international community responds. So, for example, if Western actors believe that Russia is a major threat and Wagner is a major threat, they will shift the way they behave. They may, in some countries, for example, move back from promoting democracy if they think that will push governments into the hands of Russia and Wagner. So even if actually what we're saying is that the empirical threat isn't as great as some people have suggested on social media, that could still, if it's misunderstood, lead to a significant change in international relations. So one of the things I'd really encourage us all to think about in the next sort of 10 minutes as we move to the Q&A is what's actually the impact of this going to be? What's the ability of Wagner to actually deliver security any greater than any other actor? And this is not to suggest that France and other actors have done well, but what's the ability of Wagner to actually go in and generate any kind of better security than what we've seen? We've already got evidence from Mali of a massacre of around 500 people in Mawa that we believe Wagner troops were involved in. We've already heard a little bit from some of our guests that Wagner hasn't actually been very good at re-establishing security in some of the countries in which it's operating. And in fact, it was Niger under the former elected government rather than Mali under a junta with support of Wagner did best on security over the last year. So what does that actually mean for the security of these states that now have some kind of Wagner involvement? Is that actually going to become increasingly bleak? Are we actually going to see a further decay in security in some of these countries? I also want us to get into a little bit what this might mean economically. I was struck by a piece that the Africa Center published, I think earlier this year, maybe back in June, where they noted that, Russia's trade, Russia's GDP is only the equivalent of that of Brazil or Spain, and is projected to contract by 5.5% this year, partly due to the war, and only recover to pre-war levels by 2030. And actually, Russian trade with Africa has declined every single year since 2018. Now, that doesn't suggest a country that has the economic might to really come in and do things like help to sustain healthcare systems, help to sustain education systems, actually put in the budget support that other actors who might be now leaving the scene were doing. So what does that actually mean for long-term security of development of public services and the actual ability of governments to deliver to their people? And my suspicion, and we'll see if I'm right, I'm happy to be held accountable, is that actually in 3 years' time, we'll be seeing coups in some of these countries to remove Wagner and to remove governments connected to Wagner, that actually they're going to fail economically, they're going to fail in security terms, and they will become the enemy relatively soon. They're not right now because they're an unknown quantity. France has a long period of being a known quantity. France has developed over that period of time that resentment, but Wagner, my sense is, might get there relatively quickly, because people may at the minute be being conned by the disinformation, but pretty quickly they're going to realize what's going to happen. They're going to realize who's in the mines. They're going to realize that security isn't getting better. And they're going to realize that this swap hasn't actually improved their lives. And we also know that people in many of these countries have a bedrock preference for a form of elected government, which is probably not going to be very compatible with the juntas in power and Wagner. So one of the things I'd like you all to think about a little bit as you prepare, your answers to the questions we've got from our audience is, what's the actual outlook here, security-wise, financially, economically, if we actually see 2 or 3 years of, military-led governments with relationships with Wagner and Russia? So that's it for me. Now, John, over to you. You get free hand to put any questions you might like to our panel, but also to pick up on anything that you think has been overlooked so far. And then panel, be ready. After that, we'll be going back to you to respond to John's insights and also the questions that have come in from our audience. John, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Nick, and thanks to the panel for all of your great comments. I think one thing that I think I'm particularly interested in hearing from folks, and I think Nick alluded to it as well, is first, I don't think that we've really talked about the greater structure of what's going on here, of which Russia is a benefit or is benefiting. And one thing that I think we kind of miss right now is I think first, if we believe that Wagner and Russia are a threat, what are we trying to protect first and foremost? And I would put also maybe to the panel, what would constitute Russia's kind of correct interests in its relationships with African countries, and also who would the other alternative security partners be if African governments don't want to work with Western partners? So I think that there's also some greater structural things that are going on at the moment right now where a new security alternative has arrived, albeit through contractors, and we're seeing kind of a very quick ratcheting up of the discourse as the West finds that there might be alternative security partners to them for African governments. And I'd be curious to know kind of from the panel to what extent they think African governments themselves are the ones who are at the center or in control of balancing these what we call kind of outside powers, the West versus Russia, off of each other in order to gain more resources. I really enjoyed Kisi's comments. I travel quite a bit through rural Central African Republic, and I think it's important to echo her sentiments. And one of the main problems that I think Wagner presents for us is there's not a lot of attention that's paid often to who Wagner is fighting, who's on the other side, and how, at least in my experience traveling through rural Central African Republic, I found that for the most important thing is not disinformation, it's not narratives, it's more often than not, am I safer? Can I go out to my field to cultivate, to grow some plants? Will I be robbed on my way to the next village? Can I trade a little bit? And for Central Africans who have grown up for decades of essentially precarity and instability, most people do not like armed groups. They don't like armed groups, and they value Wagner because they saw Wagner as tough on armed groups. They see that they are maybe no one's willing to die, but they see that Wagner mercenaries die, leading from the front, going after armed groups. They see a degree of sacrifice that they don't see in United Nations peacekeepers or European Union trainers. And so I guess the question that I think is often not really answered is what are you going to replace with that? Who's going to put in the investment into the Central African Republic? Who's going to put boots on the ground of people who are actually willing to die on behalf of Central Africans? Who's willing to invest in beer companies, in water companies, and kind of what is the West, if it feels threatened, offering as an alternative here? And so I guess kind of the first question, I think maybe I'll just give it to Kisi because I'm always partial to folks in Bangui. It is, what in your view do you think the other partners could offer to Central Africans at this point that would see them want to see something different, something that would an alternative to the stability that Wagner has actually brought to the country?
Do you want to take that one? I mean, we've got another question for you that's coming as well. So maybe you can take them both at the same time. I think that's a great question. I think John's challenge to us to, basically we're not comparing with nothing, right? There's got to be something on the other side. And also that reminder about the different ways that you can build legitimacy is really important. So thank you, John. The other question we had for you, just if you want to take them at the same time, was, this one. So given, and it sort of dovetails a little bit with yours, John, this is coming from our audience. So given that if France intervenes to reverse a coup, it will only lead to greater anti-French sentiment, what can and should Western powers do, if anything, for example, in Niger, but also somewhere like CAR? Do they just need to pull back and allow Wagner and Russia to play out and to, enable them to demonstrate perhaps that they're not the kind of partners that these countries want? Or should they be seeking to intervene more proactively?
As to highlight, when I say we, I talk about like civil society from Central African Republic. We try to alert more or less the Western embassy here in CAR, saying that the presence of Wagner is going to be something really that it will completely change the way people perceive their presence. I mean, the Western presence in CAR. They didn't believe us at the beginning, and it was quite frustrating for all of us. But then after, based on maybe research and all the information they gather from their, their capitals, then they realized and they saw what, the disinformation, the dynamic and other going on in CAR. They realized that, yes, they made a huge mistake by just stepping back and looking, watching Wagner's, influence growing up in CAR. And I think that today, the government is kind of playing it like safe by asking people, asking the different government. They say that they are open to different support coming from different government and other. But one thing is sure is that they will not accept. They are not really open to the idea to have like a presence of Western country more dynamic than before. They really also want to try, the Russian agenda. And it's quite good for the president, actually. So I think that one of what the Western country can give now, they just can give much that they can now, because even the capital are not really open to the idea to give money to the country or to support the president, because they are not sure of how the money will be used. So that's why there's a lot of cut in terms of like support they give to the country. So for now, it's more like to stay. They just can leave the country. If they leave, they will completely lost, their the space for them. So for me, it's important for them to stay, but to take time to rethink. And when I say rethink their strategy, for me, it's also try to be more, to be more open and to collaborate more with civil society. When I say civil society, it's not just organization, but also communities. The way Western countries really work, really Western embassy in CAR works, they are really close to the government, to the population. And I think Russian Federation, they're kind of quite the population, so it makes them more popular and they for his propaganda. So for me, it's like to stay and to really take time to to rethink the strategy based on more collaboration with the population, with civil society. So it means having more conversation with them, going on the field also to understand. Because I think there's a lot of bias in the way they perceive. They don't understand why people support Wagner. And based on that, for them, Wagner are the bad one, and they don't go further than that. And it's something that I think they have to work on, then to be able to come with some good proposition. Because they can come with whatever they want now. They will just accept, say yes, but they will not give them the space or the place that they really want.
Great. I think Marissa wants to come in now. So Marissa, I'm going to go to you. And then maybe in a minute, Samuel, I'm going to come to you because we've got a couple of questions that have come in that maybe you and John, maybe Marissa also wants to touch on this. So one that just came in on WhatsApp. Remember, guys, watching us, you WhatsApp the messages. We asked them to our panel. So do send them in. So the question that just came in, which I think is a good one, and might be striking a lot of people at home right now, is, why has Russia put so much into Wagner? Why has Wagner invested so much in these countries if Russia's overall level of trade and engagement with Africa is relatively minimal? Why is Africa of interest to Russia? I think that's an interesting question. Maybe John, maybe Samuel, maybe Marissa, someone wants to take that and have a little chat about that. And just while you're there, Marissa, the other question we had for you, in case you want to run them together, was that, we've talked a lot about security and democracy, but not much about that financial side and about corruption. But this person says, presumably that's part of the story, is it gives a reason for Wagner to operate. The rents that are there might be used to pay people off and therefore to make it economically viable and so attractive. So could you say a bit more about the financial part of the story? What do Wagner make out of this? What do Russia make out of this? Are they there altruistically, or are they there because there's a payoff?
Yeah, just to respond to the question about the why Russia is so involved in Africa, even though the economic footprint is limited. First of all, I would kind of quibble about the extent and the depth of their actual involvement there. First of all, there's limited foreign investment that we're seeing really into African countries. They're just talking about, even at the summit, $400 million in investments. Also, I think it's very often opportunistic actors like state-owned companies or Prigozhin or people like this who are dominating and dictating the agenda to profit themselves and to expand their business interests. It's not really Putin micromanaging it, investing huge amounts of time in African policy on the ground like he may have done in Syria or he's been doing in Ukraine. I just wanted to kind of challenge that a little bit, like the extent to which they're actually involved and invested. There's a lot of coverage, there's a lot of pageantry, but actually not that much substance. And I think that if you're looking at other non-economic reasons for why they would want to get involved, I think Africa has played an important role, obviously, in Russia's concept of multipolarity. And that was pretty much very clear since Yevgeny Primakov rose onto the scene as foreign minister and prime minister. He actually went and spoke to Angola. And at the time, he basically said he apologized for the disengagement of the Yeltsin-Kozyrev earlier administration. And he clearly made engaging with Africa, the African Union, as an important pole in the Russian multipolar foreign policy agenda. And that's something that's been carrying forward for the remaining 25 years, particularly now that Russian officials see the war in Ukraine, or at least are framing it to their own public, as a way to overturn unipolarity and replace it with a multipolar post-Western foreign policy. That's the way of the future. And also there's other things too, like, UNGA votes that want to see as many countries as possible neutral or abstaining on the Ukraine war-related resolutions because it makes Russia look less isolated. Africa's got the largest bloc there. There's a variety of other things that are at play here. That's not just about economics. And also I think the counterterrorism, counterinsurgency interventions were aimed at showing that they could do what they did in Syria, autocracy promotion and counterinsurgency combined together instead of freedom and counterterrorism, which is what the US likes to pair together, and they could do that elsewhere. So they promoted the Syrian model even at the grassroots level in countries like Mali, and then they tried to turn a Central African model too out into West Africa too. So it was showing that they have an alternative model of security governance as well. So those would be some of the other points where I think Russia is trying to evolve itself in Africa.
Great. Thanks so much, Samuel. Thanks for that. So now, Marissa, coming to you. We've got a couple of questions on the table for you there. Your turn.
Sure. So on the first question about why is Russia so interested in Africa and why is it's supporting the Wagner Group as well, and I think that there are two quite simple reasons. I mean, of course, there can be many reasons, and it's very multifaceted. But I think if you really just had to break it down as simply as possible, I would say that Russia is interested in Africa as a whole for the same reasons that the rest of the world is. Africa is home to some of the world's most important resources. There's oil, gas, and then there's critical minerals as well. And if you look at critical minerals, especially, these are becoming more and more important. These are becoming, prices are increasing. There's just such a big demand for what is in Africa, effectively. And the second thing is that, war is a business. We can talk about things like security governance, but it really just comes down to that. And it's a business that Russia has effectively managed to do very well in. And this is effectively what drives it. Africa gives it something to do. Africa keeps it busy. And then going to the second question about, what role does corruption play in this? I mean, I think corruption really is effectively the whole reason why the Wagner Group has been able to make inroads into the 4 African countries that it has, the ones where it has a very firm foothold. Effectively, it's only able to enter into states where there is a lack of proper governance and where leaders, effectively like the very top government leaders, are very, very corrupt. And these types of government leaders have no issue effectively with diverting a lot of state resources towards things like security and military, even while things like health, education, other types of social spending are suffering, even while they're not developing other sectors like agriculture, for example. And then, of course, there's always, you'll find in these countries, there's kind of like these backhanded deals, and this doesn't just apply to the Wagner Group, it applies to many other actors there, that basically there's always kind of these backhanded deals where, you know, people are mining for minerals, but there's some kind of agreement there in terms of how much they actually get out of that. And then the state is not really collecting the tax from those revenues like it should be, but that some of that tax is effectively going into the pockets of the groups that are facilitating that mining, and then into the pockets of those government officials. So I think in this way, then we can also understand that Russia, of course, and the Wagner Group, these are not altruistic actors, but I mean, I don't think any foreign actor is. That's just the nature of politics, and it's the nature of states. And I also think, to touch on something else that came up after the first discussion, we're talking about, you know, what should the West do? How should the West respond to it? Can it counter this alternative that Russia's offering? But I think the bigger question, or at least the question that's going to become more and more important as the years go by, is what should actually African governments be doing? Because all of this insecurity and this instability is a result of poor leadership, and it is a result of corruption. And if there is dissatisfaction with how post-colonial Africa has progressed, you know, since the 60s in some parts of Africa, obviously a little bit later in most of Southern Africa. But if we're dissatisfied with this, we have to look inwards, and we can't always look at what foreign actors are doing. Foreign actors are not coming to save Africa. They are coming to benefit themselves. And I think that we also have to remember that Africa has been the recipient of a lot of aid, and that effectively has then helped to entrench bad practices and not really establish good governance. And I think that the reason why we have to ask African governments, what should they do? And I know it sounds very philosophical because we're dealing right now with, you know, the Wagner Group in certain countries, but I think we have to ask this question because effectively in a few years' time, and I think, Nick, you mentioned this, you know, people then might say, well, actually, we're not happy with Russia. We're not happy with the Wagner Group. And this could well happen. And that would then be the fault of African leaders to use any kind of security or stability that has been created to uplift populations. And we see this across African countries all the time, where people want leaders out. So we saw it in the case of Zimbabwe, where there was a lot of support for the military coup in 2017. And, you know, fast forward 6 years later, and people are saying, we don't like President Mnangagwa anymore. Actually, things were better under Mugabe. We see the same thing happening in Angola, where people say, well, at least under the former president, Dos Santos, at least there were jobs. There's no jobs now. And it's just that if governments are not going to tackle the real issues, if they're just going to perpetuate this negative cycle of leadership that we've been in for decades, then things are effectively not going to change. And I think this is my biggest concern when looking at this kind of debate.
And I think, thanks for that, Risa. And I think there's a big risk here that if what happens is Western governments respond to the potential, you know, perceived threat of Wagner and Russia by moving away from principles and doing strategic alliance formation, right? Which is a very plausible outcome, that actually, instead of sticking up for democratic principles, we fold them when we think we're pushing them would actually push a country into Russia or Wagner's hands. What we actually do is create the perceived double standards, hypocrisy, and inconsistency that will mean that when Russia and Wagner fail, people don't see the West as an honest partner, right? And I think my message to those people, some of who may be listening today, is, you know, your job in a sense, if you really want to play a constructive role moving forwards, is you have to address what Kessie said, you have to address what John said, you have to actually deal with your own historical mistakes, and you actually have to present yourself as a more effective and viable and honest partner moving forwards, which means starting now, you have to change the way that you're behaving, right? Because otherwise people are just going to feel that all of the international options are unappealing, rather than that there's a really good option out there that might in some ways perform better. And I think that, you know, recognition that actually every time we make a sort of foreign policy decision in a principled, compromised way, that actually one of the things we do is we undermine the brand, we undermine the ability to actually engage, we undermine the willingness of anyone to take us seriously. We consistently make that decision on a case-by-case basis rather than a broader strategic basis of what would actually enable us to be seen as being a reliable partner. And I think that's something that really has to shift, right? Otherwise, we're going to end up in 3 or 4 years with people in a country like Niger being angry with Russia, angry with Wagner, but not wanting to go back to France and not wanting a relationship with America and not wanting a relationship with the UK. And that's probably not going to be a great option in terms of actually rebuilding countries. Now, Beverly, we're coming to you now. I know you want to come in on some of the things that we've been discussing, but we've also got a question for you that's come in. So I'll read out the question and then you can sort of engage as you want to the two aspects. So the question that's come in for you is, thanks so much for your insightful comments about disinformation. It seems like some of this may be also created by the West. For example, are we not seeing American actors and British actors amplifying fear of the Russian threat? I think here there's a sort of idea that this is a bit similar to the Cold War, right? Where you demonize your rival in the same way that we had British and American fear of the rise of China in Africa. And isn't there a risk that actually that kind of fear mongering generates the idea that Russia is really powerful, which then feeds into the idea that Russia and Wagner are viable partners, and hence actually creates some of the problem that we're talking about today? Over to you.
Well, yeah, it's interesting how that is also played out when you look at the situation in Niger. I remember coming across someone saying on Twitter that the West does not have, a pro-Africa policy or a policy that looks at what they can do in Africa. What they have is an anti-China and anti-Russian policy. And so you see responses like that. In the waves of protests that have been taking place in Niger, in the Sahel, it's been about invective against the West and Russia as a sort of solution. And Russia has taken advantage of that. And it's also been able to take advantage of some of the activities of the Wagner Group to be able to amplify that it is a better partner. And interestingly enough, if you think about the complicated relationship between Russia and the Wagner Group, the fact that initially Russia distanced itself from it, there was that coup or attempted coup or rebellion by Prigozhin, which put to question how they see each other or how they operate or how they take advantage of each other's presence in the region to be able to build Moscow's expansion. And how the West responds to that is also interesting. And it goes back to messaging and intentions. And I do agree with Marissa that in many instances, no one is really here for altruistic reasons. They're here to protect their interests. They're here to build and capitalize on their influence and to present themselves as being a force that has presence and resonance in the region across the board. So ultimately, African countries are stuck with certain choices. The self-reflection is really important because, for instance, African countries don't seem to have a policy on how private military firms can operate in the region. It is a region of active conflict. When the CAR was reaching out, or when Russia reached out to the CAR, how it played out in the Security Council, everyone was quite happy for this arrangement to go on. And there's been various reports of atrocities taking place. Now the same case is happening in Mali, and we're seeing it taking advantage of the situation in the wider Sahel to be able to capitalize on that. But there's still no clear policy aside from statements condemning or worrying or expressing concern over what the Wagner Group, over what Russia might be doing in terms of upsetting what foreign relations are pre-existing in the region. That is one. There's also concerns about how does the West counter this without they themselves giving into propaganda in the same way that we have seen the Wagner Group or Russia doing so. And it goes back to what Nick was talking about, whether those partnerships are positive, how they are empowering, because Russia has been able to really play to its advantage the fact that it is an empowering partner. Throughout the Ukraine war, for instance, it has made deliveries, even though it doesn't have a big footprint, of military aid to Mali, of food aid to Burkina Faso, and to other places where it has these so-called partnerships. And it's at the very bare minimum that it's able to continue capitalizing on this. So it does call for a lot of reflection, with countries being able to preempt the areas that are at risk and perhaps build resilience around that politically, through policy, through security, and through partnerships that are seen to be mutually beneficial, not just for the sake of the phrase, but also that are really beneficial to those countries.
Thanks so much. I think that's a really smart point. And I think this is one of the places also in which, time is perhaps going to change things. I mean, I remember China coming to Africa and a lot of debates about, China being seen as a non-colonial kind of power, non-conditionality. that shifted relatively quickly, especially when people started to become more aware of the massive trade imbalances. And now we get, activism and concern about the role of China and the idea that China might be taking, certain kinds of infrastructure. A lot of that has been shown to actually be disinformation, but it shows you how quickly that cycle of information can switch against you. And it's interesting to me how many people, exactly, in those WhatsApp conversations frame Russia as a liberating power, presumably not with much evidence or knowledge of what happened to Poland, right, over the last 50 years. What happened to many of the countries in the Russian sphere of influence. So I think what we'll see as Russia becomes a more prominent actor may also be a process of education, information that also will make it harder to put those positive spins on things, and they may see themselves again in 4 or 5 years in a very different place. But John, we kind of broke off in the middle of your comments because you put a great question to Kessie. I want to come back to you. You've heard, a lot more of the discussion now. Final thoughts from you, and then I'll ask anyone on our panel if they've got anything burning they desperately want to say, and then after that it'll be back to Jeff and Mantade. So John, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things I guess I worry about when it comes to kind of conversations over information, disinformation, misinformation is I think folks are going to have to a certain point accept that people come out of different historical contexts, and ultimately, I don't think a lot of people in the Central African Republic are going to view Paris in the same way that Americans do. For people who've grown up in Francophone countries, I mean, I'm 35. I mean, the equivalent would be that, my grandfather would be, if I grew up in Car, my grandfather could have been, captured for porterage by French officials. They built the first high school in 1955 when my dad was born. And so, and then had seen interventions, since that time. I don't think that people are going to come from the same historical context, nor should we necessarily expect them to. And I think, as some folks on here have said, the West, I mean, specifically France, Britain, other European countries, their colonial past is fair game for Russia. I think Russia is allowed to engage in politics in the same way that the West can engage in politics and point out Russia's own imperial past, as they should do. And so I think there needs to be a lot more, I think, as Marissa said, a lot more introspection about the role that the West has played and actually what the West colonial history is, in order to kind of counter those narratives, rather than try and focus on necessarily kind of how Russia takes advantage of it, more than anything else. And then I think at the same time too, we have to remember kind of or differentiate between correlation and causation. I think, as Marissa said, it shouldn't be surprising that Wagner is showing up in places where there's conflict. It is a private military company. It probably won't show up in Tanzania because Tanzania right now probably doesn't need a bunch of mercenaries. And so we shouldn't be surprised that a PMC is arriving in these places. These are also places where other PMCs are operating and doing business. We shouldn't be surprised that they're engaged in mineral resources, because it's not a cause, but the presence of mineral resources, the presence of corruption are correlated to conflict, and often these governments are cash strapped, and they need a way to outsource their security, which goes back decades, to kind of colonial times, this type of outsourcing, and not have to pay cash out of hand. And so, ultimately, Wagner, I think, as some folks have been saying, is a symptom of greater structural issues. It's not the cause of conflict in Africa. It's not the driving force of conflict in Africa. And I think that's probably the most important thing to remember, because Wagner has certainly affected, I think, some of the internal balances within the ecosystems of the conflicts in which they operate. But these are highly complex conflicts with a lot of local actors and powerful local agencies who are also taking advantage of Wagner. And Wagner hasn't replaced the greater overall structure of African governments' relationships with outside powers. We see that local governments continue to bring in outside forces in order to enhance their own position domestically and politically. And Wagner is ultimately a tool. And perhaps later on, it's a very useful tool because at some point Bamako might be able to go to the West and say, you know what, you're right about Wagner. These guys are bad news. What are you going to give us if we get rid of them? And I wonder, to what extent the human rights records that had previously existed could kind of be forgotten in that point. So I'll end there.
No, I think they're really great points, John. And that point that there's a broader political economy here, right, which existed before Wagner, will exist after Wagner, is a great one. The point that there are other groups operating is also a great one, right? I mean, a couple of us on the call might be old enough to, remember a time when we were talking about executive outcomes, right? This is not the first mercenary group that's operated, and again, it won't be the last. So I think that point about, thinking about how Wagner fits into the existing context and the way in which that plays out and what therefore is likely to happen is important. And as you say, it makes us reflect on, much more carefully what's actually likely to change, and is anything fundamental actually going to change. And if anyone's interested, who's listening, who wants to know more about this, I mean, my website, Democracy in Africa, we published a great piece on the shadow states and state capture in Africa, where people looked at about 11 different countries, looking at exactly these kinds of international networks that take money out of countries. And many of them are happening in, supposed democracies. Many of them are happening with Western states who are supposedly democratic, and with others like Dubai and so on. And so I think it's a really important point that we should not imagine that Russia is doing things that nobody else is doing. And that's a really good reminder, although we're focusing on that topic today, that we don't want to, create that impression that Russia's the only challenge there. We've had a hand late flag thrown in from, I think we had Kessie and Marissa, who want to make one final point before we draw it over. So over to you guys. You get the final words, Kessie and then Marissa.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. I just want to mention something. I think that kind of conversation we are just having now, I think it's quite important. It's very, very important. But I realized that, I found that kind of conversation in like more English-speaking areas than French-speaking areas. And I think it's important also to try to open the space to have more conversation on Wagner, in French, because like when it's time, when we try to kind of face meat and realities, I think that French speaker also have a lot to say. The second thing I want to mention also is like there's the civil society, mainly in those countries where Wagner is present, they don't have space to talk about the topic of Wagner. So like creating space for them is also important. And the third thing is that Wagner is there to stay in countries such as Central African Republic or Mali. They are really not ready to leave our countries. And I think that it's also an opportunity to keep like really support kind of the dynamic in terms of accountability, but also justice, because I know a lot of victims of Wagner, they don't have space, or, they don't know where to go in terms, to looking for justice when they are receiving, when they have been attacked by Wagner. And I think it's something that we have to pay attention to also when we create that kind of a space we are having here at some point.
Thanks so much. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Marissa, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, just to quickly touch on something that John said about how, people come from different historical contexts, and then that is in the way that we approach debates differently. I think that it's a good point and it's a valid point, but I just would want to be careful in the sense that we risk kind of undermining our agency if we say that we're kind of beholden to these historical contexts. I think that in African countries, I think ideological debates do have a lot more influence than perhaps they need to. But I think that we also have to carry on looking forward and saying that, I think that Russia and Wagner in the countries where they operate, they do have a lot of influence because they've managed to kind of find a vacuum. But generally, people don't like conflict. They don't like instability. They want development and they want to move forward. And I think that most people can see that, and that if as a whole that agency can be acknowledged and there's a less dependency on what foreign actors can do for us, I think that's where we start to actually move forward.
I think that's a great point on which to end, Marissa. So thank you so much for that. And with that, we'll pass it back to Jeffrey Mantade to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Nick. This has been very informative. We would have loved to keep this conversation going. Time, however, does not permit us to do so. A special shout out to our speaker today for a job well done. Our team at the Resistance Bureau looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you and to highlighting the important work that you do moving forward. Of course, thanks to our audience as well for engaging with us and for tuning in. Please stay in touch between shows by visiting our website, www.theresistancebureau.com, and by subscribing on our homepage to get updates on the show, as well as show summaries and participant videos. On our website, you can also revisit past shows, all of which are saved in the episode section. We're also on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. We have all your bases covered. As a final note, the continued impact of this program is a real testament to the efforts of our entire team. As always, thanks to our tech manager, Peter Dory, and our creative director, Donna Msaga, who work behind the scenes to make the Resistance Bureau a continued success. Thank you again for joining us today. We truly appreciate it. Stay safe in the meantime, keep fighting the good fight, and see you next time.